What if Peter Ure, the great Russian Tsar who built a fleet and dreamed of the Baltic Sea, had received such a slap in the face from the Swedes that his imperial ambitions would have remained only in books? Just imagine, 1721, the Great Northern War, which in reality was a Russian triumph, does not end with the Peace of Neustadt, where Sweden gives up its lands, but rather with the Swedish king Charles XII, the warrior in the crown, forcing Peter to flee back to Moscow, leaving the Baltic alone. The paradox is that Sweden in the early 18th century was a real power, the Lion of the North, as it was called, with an iron army and ambitions that stretched from Finland to Poland. But Charles XII, despite his military genius, lost everything because of one fatal mistake, a campaign to Poltava in 1709, where he was defeated. What if he had not gone there? What if Sweden had won the war and remained the hegemon of Northern Europe? This topic is a real treasure for those who like to imagine how history could have turned out differently. Because think about it, the Great Northern War was not just a fight for pieces of land between Sweden, Russia, Poland, and Denmark. It was the moment when Russia rose and Sweden fell. In reality, after the victory, Peter the Great began to build St. Petersburg, bring Russia to the European arena, and even call himself emperor. And Sweden? It lost its status as a great power, gave up the Baltic lands, and quietly faded into the shadows, focusing on its internal affairs. But imagine if Charles XII had not lost. What if he had outplayed Peter, preserved the Swedish Empire, and forced Europe to dance to his tune? Maybe we would all be drinking Swedish vodka instead of Russian, and St. Petersburg would still be a swamp with 3 houses. The irony is that Charles, who in reality died from a stray bullet in 1718, could have become the Napoleon of his time, only without such a sad ending. Why is it interesting? Because this is a story about how one battle, one choice, can change the fate of an entire continent. Sweden could have remained a great power, Russia could have remained a backward periphery, and Europe could have become a completely different place. It's a chance to look at the past from a new perspective, to laugh at the ambitions of kings and queens, and to think, what if? So pour yourself a cup of coffee, or maybe some Swedish mulled wine to get into the mood, and get ready for a story that will make it hard to tear yourself away. We are going to dive into a world where Sweden not only won the war, but redrew the map of Europe. Are you ready? Then go ahead. The Swedish guns are already loaded. So, let's imagine the year 1709. Charles XII, the King of Sweden, is faced with a choice: to lead his army to Poltava, where Peter the Great's troops are waiting for him, or to change his strategy. In real history, he chose Poltava, and it was his biggest mistake. But in our alternate reality, Charles listens to his generals, who beg, "Your Majesty, let's not go deep into Ukraine. There are only swamps and Cossacks shooting from the bushes." Instead, he turns his troops north, strengthens his positions in the Baltic states, and focuses on defending Swedish lands. How would all this have gone on? Let's figure it out. Without magic and dragons, but with a good dose of common sense and a bit of humor about royal ambitions. Charles XII avoids Poltava, and this changes the course of the war. Instead of defeating the Swedes, Peter the Great faces problems. His army, exhausted by campaigns, cannot break through Swedish fortifications in Estonia and Livonia, modern Baltic countries. The Swedish navy, which in reality was weakened, dominates the Baltic Sea here, cutting off Russian supplies. Charles, known for his iron discipline, conducts brilliant campaigns. He defeats the Danes in 1710, forcing them to withdraw from the war, and then defeats the Polish-Saxon forces of Augustus II, Peter's ally. By 1715, Sweden regains control of Poland, installing a puppet king, such as Stanisław Leszczyński, who in reality was never able to hold the throne. The irony is that Peter, who dreamed of a window to Europe, now looks at the Baltic through closed doors, and Charles the Pointed jokes at banquets. Let the Tsar build his fleet on the Volga. It's calmer there. Until 1721, when the war ended in reality with the Peace of Neustadt, everything was the other way around. Sweden dictates the terms, Russia retreats, losing access to the Baltic, and Peter is forced to focus on internal reforms, which are much slower without European influence. Sweden retains its territories, Finland, Estonia, and Livonia, and even expands its influence by gaining part of the Polish lands. Charles XII, who in reality died in 1718, lives here until 1725, becoming a symbol of Swedish power. His army, equipped with the best guns and trained according to European standards, became a model for other countries. Swedish engineers improved fortifications, and the Navy, one of the strongest in Europe, controlled trade in the Baltic, forcing even Britain to respect the Lions of the North. But what about Russia? Without victory in the war, Peter the Great cannot boast of the title of emperor. St. Petersburg never becomes a window to Europe. Instead, Russia focuses on its southern borders, fighting the Ottoman Empire, but without much success. Peter's reforms are stalled. Without access to the Baltic, trade with Europe is weak, and the Russian elite, which in reality admired European ideas, remains isolated here. Imagine, instead of Baroque palaces, there are old wooden teremas, and instead of European wigs, there are waist-length beards. The irony is that Peter, who loved everything European, could have become an isolationist czar in this reality, and his dream of a navy would have remained a dream except for fishing on the Volga. In Europe, meanwhile, Sweden was becoming a new center of gravity. Charles XII, having strengthened the empire, began to invest in science and education. The Swedish universities in Uppsala and Lund became centers of enlightenment earlier than in reality. Swedish engineers improved cannons and ships, and trade with the Hanseatic League brings wealth. By the 1750s, Sweden was not just a military power, but a cultural and economic leader in Northern Europe. Its influence reaches even America. Swedish colonists are more actively exploring the New World, and the colony of New Sweden, modern Delaware, grows to become an important trade center. Imagine, instead of the English colonies in Eastern America, there are Swedish forts where people drink mulled wine and sing sagas about Charles XII. But not everything is so smooth. The Swedish Empire, though strong, is facing internal problems. Constant wars deplete the budget, and after the death of Charles XII in 1725, his successors are not so charismatic. By the 1770s, discontent was growing in Sweden. Peasants complained about taxes, and the nobility demanded more power. In Poland, which was under Swedish control, uprisings began. The Poles did not want to be puppets. Russia, although weakened, does not give up. By the 1750s, a new Tsar, say Alexei Petrovich, son of Peter the Great, begins a slow revival, focusing on Siberia and trade with China. The irony is that while Sweden is celebrating its greatness, its enemies are quietly preparing for revenge, just like in a good TV series where the hero doesn't notice that he is already being followed. How does this affect the present? Europe without a strong Russia looks different. There is no Russian bear that frightened everyone in the 18th century, which means that the balance of power is shifting. Austria and Prussia become the main players in Central Europe, and Britain, having no strong competitor in the East, focuses on maritime expansion. Sweden, retaining its status as a great power, could become a Scandinavian empire by uniting Norway and Denmark under its flag by the 1800s. And what about culture? Swedish literature and music are flourishing. Imagine that instead of Russian classics like Pushkin, we read Swedish sagas about the Baltic Sea, and instead of Tchaikovsky, we listen to Swedish composers writing symphonies about the victories of Charles the Winding. What if this had really happened? Maybe we would all speak Swedish and consider mulled wine the national drink. So what do we have in this alternative history? Sweden wins the Great Northern War, and Charles XII becomes not just a warrior in a crown, but the architect of a new Europe. By the 1800s, Sweden is a Scandinavian empire that unites the North, controls the Baltic, and even has colonies in America. Russia, with no access to the sea, remains a backward state centered on Siberia, and Peter the Great never became great in the eyes of Europe. Poland is under Swedish influence, Denmark is annexed to the empire, and the Baltic Sea is a Swedish lake where every ship pays a duty to Stockholm. Swedish culture is flourishing, universities, literature, music. All this makes Sweden a center of enlightenment, and its navy and cannons make even Britain respect the Lions of the North. But is everything so perfect? Sweden, though strong, is not eternal. Internal uprisings, Polish revolts, and the slow revival of Russia remind us that empires do not last forever. Europe without Russian influence is becoming an arena for Austria, Prussia, and Britain, which are dividing spheres of influence. And in America, the Swedish colonies, although prosperous, face competition from the British, who do not like anyone to interfere with their plans. This story makes us think about how fragile everything is in the real world. If Charles XII hadn't marched on Poltava, we could be living in a Europe where Sweden is not just a country of IKEA and ABBA, but a real superpower, where mulled wine flows like a river and the Baltic sagas are taught in every school. Maybe the world would be more northern, cold but fair, or just more harsh, with guns instead of diplomacy. The irony is that we like to think of Peter the Great as a great reformer, but in this reality, he could have remained a landlocked king, and Charles the Rotten could have become a legend about whom books are written and TV shows are made. Imagine yourself in this world. You are drinking Swedish vodka at a banquet in Stockholm, listening to a symphony about the victory in the Baltic, and outside the window you see ships with dragon heads sailing to America. It's funny, but a little tempting, isn't it? Maybe we're lucky that history has turned out the way it has. At least we have St. Petersburg, not just a swamp with 3 houses. If you enjoyed thinking about such what-ifs, please like this article. It's a sign that together we can spin the wheel of history and see where it takes us. And subscribe because there are many more such journeys ahead, from the Swedes to someone else who could change the world. Let's figure out together how history would have turned out. It's more interesting than just reading old chronicles. So see you in the next alternative reality. Keep your mulled wine ready and don't forget your Swedish accent.